So over the holiday, I read Vue.js Up and Running by Callum Macrae, and this is my first exposure to Vue.js, which is currently at 2.5.21. And after having read the book, I actually felt like I could start developing a Vue.js application. So that's exactly what I wanted to try and do, essentially create a little hello world application with Webpack and Vue.js. So I wanted to keep it simple but complex enough to explore some features of Vue.js. So I have a list of friends here, and essentially I can add to the list and delete from the list. And you'll see that I have some reactivity with the number of items here. I also have two embedded components, so this form here is an embedded component, and each of these individual friends is an embedded component. And then I have some logic around whether or not I show a particular UI. So let's take a quick look and see how this works under the hood. So this is main.js. This is my entry into my Vue application. And what you'll see is that the root Vue instance does nothing but render the root component of the application, my app component. But you'll see that I also have a provide function here, which returns an object that sets up dependency injection for the rest of the nested components. Now, the Vue.js Up and Running book didn't actually talk about dependency injection, but it is something that I absolutely love in Angular, so it's something that I want to explore at least a little bit in Vue.js. And this is one of the few things that I actually looked up. But for the most part, this is all based on things that I learned in the book. Plus obviously my novice interpretation, my own biases, and my history with Angular, and so on and so forth. So let's take a look at the app component. The app component uses the single file component model, which means that it has a style, a template, and a script tag for the actual Vue class. Now you'll see that I actually have an external file for my CSS, and in fact I'm actually using less CSS in this case, and that's just because I typically find that CSS doesn't add a whole lot to a demo, so I try to tuck it away when possible. Of course, as it gets longer, I like to have both the style and the template in their own separate files for maintainability, and you can have a source attribute in your template as well, but I haven't done that in this case. Now, one thing that was confusing to me about Vue.js when I first started reading the book was that unlike Angular, where the rendered element is the host element of the component, each Vue.js component has to render its own root element, much like React used to be before. I think you could do what's called fragments, although I haven't experimented with that yet. So here, this is the actual root of my application. And in fact, right, if we jump back into the main.js, even though I'm rendering something called app component, if we jump over into the browser and look at the root of this application, what you'll see is that the root of the application is a div with class app. And if we jump back into the code, you'll see that my app component renders a div with class app. So each Vue component is responsible for rendering its own host element. Now, I also have some nested components here that are strictly presentational, meaning they don't maintain much internal state. They don't really manage data. They're really just about inputs and outputs. And in this case, I have the form, which emits an add event for adding a particular friend, right? That's this right here. It emitted the name, which I then turn around and add to the particular collection. I then also iterate over the list of friends, and inside of each list item, I have a friend component that I'm passing a friend into, and I'm listening for a delete event. Now, these events for delete and add, I'm binding to with component methods, add friend and delete friend. If we look down here in my Vue class, you'll see that I provide methods for adding a friend and deleting a friend. In this case, I'm just pushing a new friend onto the array when I add, and for delete, I'm locating the index of the given friend and I'm splicing it out of the collection. So I'm not using immutable data here, but because friends is defined as part of the data structure, we get the native reactivity out of the box with Vue because Vue adds some listeners on the array methods. And let's just take a quick look at the nested components. So friend form components, take a quick peek at that. Super simple. Again, because each component is responsible for rendering its own host element, there is no friend form component in my rendered markup. There is simply a form which again we can see if we dig down into the page here. You can see that here is the form data with class form, and you'll see here class form. Now one thing to notice is that each of these elements has a special data attribute, and that's for the scoped CSS, which you can see here when I link to my external less file. I'm telling it to use scoped. Because of that, Vue is injecting these attribute selectors, essentially, or what will be used as attribute selectors in the CSS, dynamically into the template. And this appears to happen at compile time, which is actually really great. And again, it's not really doing anything. This one has a little bit of internal state with name, but essentially it just emits an event and then clears that name. And then if we just want to take a look at the other one, which is the friend component inside of my friend list, you'll see here again a very simple component. It renders its own host element friend, it renders the name, and for the delete action, you'll see that it emits a delete event with the given friend. So that's really all there is to this. Again, it's fairly simple. There's not a whole lot going on, but we're seeing some, I think, interesting aspects of Vue. We're seeing a little bit of dependency injection, we're seeing some nested components, we're seeing events, we're seeing props, we're seeing scoped CSS, we're seeing conditional rendering here with if and else. Yeah, I guess that's all there is to it. The Webpack configuration, I'm by no means intelligent when it comes to Webpack. I basically just do what I can until I get it to work. In this case, I'm essentially just following what is outlined in a number of other tutorials. I'm using the Vue loader. I'm also using Babel loader. And then I just happen to use the less loader because I prefer less over writing CSS directly. Please don't take anything in this Webpack as the way forward. Again, I don't really know what I'm doing when it comes to Webpack. I just go until it works. And it does seem to work, at least in this particular case. I'm sure your mileage may vary. And if nothing else, again, this is my very first exposure to Vue.js. This is the first lines of Vue.js code that I've written. And pretty much all of the code that you're seeing here in this demo application are based on things that I learned in the Vue.js Up and Running book by Callum Macrae. So huge props to him for making that book super accessible. I read it in about 3 days, very leisurely 3 days over the holiday break. And it left me with, I think, at least a very foundational understanding of how Vue.js works, and it made me confident enough to be able to write something like this without looking at the documentation, except for the dependency injection stuff, which is not in the book. And there you go. Pretty excited.